My mother-in-law said it the way she said most difficult things. Quietly, calmly, with a particular measured control of a woman who had spent 63 years learning exactly how much force was required to deliver a wound without looking like she was trying to inflict one. "Meredith," she said, setting down her fork with the careful deliberateness of someone making a formal announcement, "I think we need to have an honest conversation about whether you're truly suited for this family." The table went quiet the way dining room tables go quiet at Christmas, when something unavoidable has finally arrived, a hush that moves through the room like a temperature drop, the candles flickering in the cold draft of what has just been said. It was December 23rd. We were 11 people around a table in the Hargrove family home in upstate New York, a house that had been in the family for 3 generations, and that announced this fact in the particular way of homes that have been inhabited and maintained with sustained, deliberate pride, the portraits on the walls, the silver that had been polished until it reflected the room back with a mirror's precision, the specific gravity of every object in every room communicating that this was a house with a history and that the history mattered. I was 32 years old. I had been engaged to Thomas Hargrove for 4 months, had been dating him for 2 years before that, had been accepted into his family's gatherings with the particular cautious warmth of a family that had not yet decided whether to fully open the door, but was willing to leave it ajar while they made up their minds. The engagement had apparently accelerated whatever private timeline Vivian Hargrove had been operating on. "I don't think this is the right moment," Thomas said immediately, his voice carrying the particular strain of a man who had been anticipating this conversation and had hoped, against the evidence of 32 years of knowing his mother, that Christmas dinner might provide some temporary immunity. "I think it's exactly the right moment," Vivian said. She looked at me, her expression not unkind precisely, but carrying the quality of absolute conviction that some people develop when they have spent decades being accustomed to having their judgments treated as final. "I simply want Meredith to understand where we stand as a family before this goes further. She's a lovely person. I'm sure she's very capable at whatever she does. But the Hargrove family has standards that go back several generations, and I'm not certain she understands what marrying into this family actually means." "Mom," Thomas said. "Let me finish," Vivian said, with the quiet authority of someone who rarely had to ask twice. She looked at me again. "Meredith, I want you to return the ring. Not because I dislike you, but because I believe, and this is said with genuine concern for everyone involved, that this match will make you both unhappy eventually, and it's better to address that now than after a wedding." I want to describe what I felt in that moment, because it was not simple. I was not devastated. I want to be precise about that, because the assumption, which I could see operating in the faces of some of the people around that table, was that being told to return the ring would produce in me a particular kind of visible emotional collapse, the kind that would confirm Vivian's implicit assessment that I was not quite steady enough, not quite composed enough, not quite Hargrove enough to belong at this table. What I actually felt was something considerably more complicated. There was hurt, genuine hurt, the specific pain of being publicly evaluated and found lacking by someone whose opinion of you has weight precisely because she is the mother of the person you intend to marry. There was anger, quiet and cold, the kind that does not produce scenes but that settles into something careful and watchful. And underneath both of those things, there was a particular clarity, the kind that comes, in my experience, from situations that require you to decide, quickly and without the luxury of extended reflection, exactly who you are and what you are willing to do. I had spent 11 years in a career that had repeatedly required me to make that kind of decision under conditions considerably more demanding than a Christmas dinner in upstate New York. I looked at Vivian Hargrove calmly. "Thank you for being direct," I said. "I'll take what you've said seriously." Then I returned to my food. I should tell you who I am, because what comes later will not make sense without it. My name is Meredith Cole. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, the kind of town that is defined more by what it lacks than by what it contains, no significant industry, no prestigious institutions, no particular claim to the kind of history that the Hargrove family's home commemorated in 3 generations of portraits. My father had worked in a machine shop until the shop closed. My mother had worked various jobs, retail, and administrative work, mostly whatever was available. I had enlisted in the Navy at 18, for reasons that were partly practical and partly the result of a 17-year-old's instinctive understanding that the life available to her in that small Pennsylvania town was not the life she was willing to accept as the full extent of what was possible. I had spent 11 years building a career that took me, across that decade, through a series of increasingly demanding roles, first in conventional naval service, then, after my 4th year, into a specialized unit whose function I am able to describe only in the most general terms even now. The unit conducted what I can characterize as high-risk maritime operations in contested environments, operations whose specific details remain largely classified, but whose general significance I can convey by saying that the people who understood what we actually did tended to speak about it with a particular gravity that made clear they grasped the gap between what the public understood about naval operations and what was actually occurring. I had been given, across those 11 years, a call sign that I had earned through a specific operation in my 3rd year with the unit, an operation that I am not going to describe in detail here, but that had involved conditions and decisions that the people who knew about it still, years later, mentioned with a certain careful reverence. The call sign was Iron Veil. It was known within a specific circle of people who had clearance to know such things as belonging to a particular kind of operator, the kind whose judgment under pressure was considered, by people who had extensive experience evaluating such things, to be exceptionally reliable. I had not told Thomas the full extent of this. I had told him I was in the Navy, that I worked in operations, that much of what I did could not be discussed in specific terms. He had accepted this with the particular trust of someone who loves a person and has decided that the parts of that person's life that cannot be shared are accepted as part of the whole. He did not push for specifics. He had never pushed across 2 years of dating and 4 months of engagement, and I had loved him, among other things, for exactly this quality. His family was another matter. The Hargroves were not wealthy in the way that some of the families I had encountered through Thomas's professional world were wealthy, not the ostentatious, newly assembled kind of wealth that announces itself through obvious display. Their wealth was older and quieter and more thoroughly embedded in who they understood themselves to be. The portraits on the wall, the silver at the table, the house that had belonged to 3 generations and that held, in every room, the particular weight of accumulated inheritance. Vivian Hargrove had met me for the first time approximately 2 years earlier, at a family dinner Thomas had arranged with some deliberate care, a careful, planned first introduction that he had clearly thought about beforehand. I had liked her, initially. She had a sharp intelligence and a dry wit that I had found, in those first hours, genuinely entertaining. What I had understood more gradually, over the months since, was that Vivian's intelligence and her wit were both deployed in service of a worldview that had been constructed with considerable care over 63 years, and that was not, fundamentally, open to revision. She had her assessments. She made them quickly, revised them rarely, and communicated them with a particular confident quietness of someone who has spent decades having her judgments treated as authoritative. Her assessment of me had been formed, I believe, very early in our acquaintance and had not substantially changed in the 2 years since. I was not from the right background. My family had no comparable history. My career, which I could not describe in specific terms, produced, in Vivian's mind, a vague impression of moderate professional attainment, something military, something ordinary, something that did not register as particularly significant in the register of significance she used to assess such things. She had never said, before that Christmas dinner, anything quite as direct as what she said at the table. She had communicated her reservations through smaller, more deniable channels, the careful questions about my family that implied judgment without stating it, the particular tone in which she said certain things about Thomas's future, the way she occasionally treated me like a guest who was visiting rather than a member of the family who was in the process of becoming permanent. The Christmas dinner had apparently been the moment she decided that indirection was no longer sufficient. After dinner, the family dispersed into the various rooms of the house in the particular way that families navigate the aftermath of a charged meal, some going to the living room, some finding reasons to be in the kitchen, the specific social choreography of people who need to process what has just happened without directly addressing it. Thomas found me in the hallway outside the dining room, his expression carrying genuine distress. "I'm going to talk to her," he said immediately. "Thomas," I said. "No, this time it's too far. She's been doing this in small ways for months, and I've let it slide because I thought she'd come around. She's not going to come around on her own. I have to say something directly. I looked at him. He was 34 years old, the kind of man who was better at love than he was at family confrontation, who found the direct challenge of his mother's opinions genuinely difficult in a way that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with the particular weight of 34 years of a specific family dynamic. Say what you need to say, I told him. But Thomas, I want you to understand something. Whatever your mother thinks about whether I belong in this family, it doesn't change what I know about myself. She doesn't have information about my life that would allow her to make the assessment she's making. She's making it based on what she can see, and what she can see is a very small portion of what's actually there. He looked at me carefully. What does that mean? I thought about how to answer honestly within the limits of what I could actually say. It means that there are significant things about who I am and what I've built that I can't fully share, even with you, in specific terms. And that the people who do know those things, the people who have the context to actually evaluate what I've done and what I'm worth in the professional sense, would not recognize in your mother's assessment of me anything that resembles the truth. He was quiet for a moment. Is there something I should know? That you could tell me? There are things I wish I could tell you more specifically, I said. Most of it I can't. But I want you to trust, and I'm asking you directly for this trust, because I've never asked you for it in quite this way before, that when I tell you your mother's assessment of me is based on insufficient information, I mean that as a precise and factual statement, not as a defensive response to someone who has just wounded my feelings. Thomas looked at me with the particular expression that had made me fall in love with him, the expression of a man who is genuinely trying to understand something rather than simply managing a situation. I trust you, he said. Then go talk to your mother, I said. And I'll be in the library if you need me. The Hargrove family library was a room that had clearly been the center of gravity for several generations of serious people, walls of books, a fireplace that had been burning all evening, the specific smell of old paper and wood smoke that I found, in that moment, unexpectedly comforting. I sat in one of the large chairs near the fire and looked at the flames and did what I had learned, across 11 years of military service, to do when the external circumstances were outside my immediate control. I thought carefully about what I actually knew, what was actually true, and what the situation actually required of me. Thomas's father came into the room approximately 20 minutes after I had settled there. Gerald Hargrove was 67 years old. He was a man I had liked from the very first time I met him, which was not true of everyone in Thomas's family. He had a particular quality of stillness that I recognized from professional experience, the particular composure of someone who had encountered genuinely difficult situations in their life, and had learned, through that encounter, that composure was not the absence of feeling, but the disciplined management of it. He had served in the Navy himself, 30 years earlier, for 6 years before transitioning into a civilian career in engineering. He did not talk about his service often. I had learned, in the way you learn things about people who carry their history quietly, that his service had been real and demanding in ways that the brevity with which he described it did not reflect. He sat down in the chair across from me, near the fire, without the particular social performance that most people bring to an awkward situation. I'm sorry about what happened at dinner, he said simply. You don't have to apologize for your wife, I said. I know I don't have to, he said. I'm doing it because I want to, because what she said was wrong, and I should have said so at the table rather than waiting until now. I looked at him. Why didn't you? He considered this. Because I've been married for 40 years, and there are moments when challenging Vivian in public produces outcomes that help no one. I should have found a way to do it more gracefully. I didn't, and for that I am sorry. We sat for a moment in the particular silence of two people who are not performing anything for each other, just sitting with the real shape of a difficult situation. Then Gerald said something that changed the quality of the conversation entirely. Can I ask you something directly? Go ahead, I said. When Thomas introduced us, 2 years ago, he said you were in the Navy, in operations. He said you couldn't discuss the specifics of what you did. He paused, looking at the fire rather than at me. I spent 6 years in the Navy myself. Long time ago. But I still have some understanding of how the institution works, including the parts that don't get discussed in social settings. I waited. I've watched you. Across 2 years of family gatherings, Gerald said. The way you move through difficult situations. The particular quality of attention you bring to a room. The composure under pressure that showed itself very clearly this evening. He looked at me now, directly. I was in a standard deployment. Nothing classified. Nothing significant in the scheme of what the Navy actually does. But I was around, briefly, people who did work that was significantly different from mine, and there was a quality to those people that I recognized immediately, the same quality I've recognized in you since Thomas first brought you home. I did not respond, maintaining the careful stillness I had learned to bring to conversations that were moving toward territory I could not confirm or deny. "I'm not asking you to confirm anything," Gerald said. "I just want you to know that whatever Vivian's assessment is based on, mine is based on 2 years of watching you in this family, and my assessment is considerably different from hers." "Thank you," I said. "That means a great deal." Gerald nodded, looking back at the fire. Then he said, almost to himself, "Iron Veil." The fire crackled. The room held a particular quality of silence. I looked at him steadily. I did not confirm. I did not deny. I simply held his gaze and let the silence do what silence does when two people are communicating something that neither of them is able to say directly. Gerald's expression shifted, very slightly. The particular expression of a man who has just received the confirmation he was looking for without anyone having technically provided it. "I see," he said quietly. I need to explain what those 2 words meant, and why Gerald Hargrove's knowing them changed the entire shape of that evening. The call sign Iron Veil had been assigned to me following an operation in my 3rd year with a specialized unit, an operation I will not describe in specific detail here. What I can tell you is that the call sign had circulated, within very narrow and appropriate channels, as belonging to an operator of a particular kind, the kind whose specific judgment and specific actions under specific conditions had been evaluated by the people whose job it was to evaluate such things and found to be, in their precise professional assessment, extraordinary. Call signs like that, the ones that carry genuine weight rather than simply serving as identification, do not travel widely. They remain inside the circles where they are relevant, known only to people with appropriate clearance and appropriate context to understand what they represent. Gerald Hargrove had left the Navy 30 years earlier. Whatever channels through which a piece of information like that might have reached him were not ones I could have anticipated, and they were not ones I was going to ask about in a family library on Christmas Eve. But the fact of his knowing it, the fact that he had spoken it quietly in a room where no one else could hear, told me several things simultaneously. That Gerald had maintained, across 30 years of civilian life, connections to former colleagues that gave him occasional access to information he should not, technically, have possessed, and that those connections had led him, at some point, to hear the name Iron Veil and to attach significance to it. And that he had spent 2 years looking at the woman his son had brought home, and had eventually, by whatever private process his particular combination of experience and observation produced, arrived at a conclusion that his wife had not. He had looked more carefully. He had asked better questions. He had paid attention to the evidence that was available to him, the quality of how I moved through difficult situations, the particular composure that he had recognized from his own brief proximity to people who did genuinely significant work, and he had arrived, without any direct confirmation from me, at a conclusion that was, in its broad outlines, accurate. "What do you intend to do?" Gerald asked, after the silence had settled into something understood between us. "About Vivian's request?" I said. "About all of it. I thought about this honestly. I intend to marry your son," I said. "Not because I need to prove something to your wife or to anyone else. Because I love him, and because I believe we'll build something real together. The question of whether your family considers me suitable is something I care about genuinely because it matters to Thomas, and because Thomas's happiness in his relationship with his family matters to me. But it's not the determinative question. I've made decisions under conditions where the stakes were considerably higher than this, and I've learned, through making those decisions, what actually matters and what doesn't." Gerald looked at me for a long moment. "Will you let me talk to Vivian?" he said. "Not to argue with her. Not to tell her she's wrong in the way that ends a conversation rather than opening one. But to share with her what I believe I know, within the limits of what's appropriate to share." I considered this carefully. "I'm not going to confirm anything you say to her," I said. "Whatever you believe you know, you arrived at it on your own. I can't validate it." I understand completely, Gerald said. I'm not asking you to. Then yes, I said. Say what you believe is true. He nodded once. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and walked out of the library with the unhurried directness of a man who has made a decision and is implementing it. I stayed in the library for another hour, listening to the fire, watching the flames move, thinking about the various shapes of the evening and what they meant. Thomas came to find me near 9 o'clock. My father talked to my mother, he said, settling into the chair his father had occupied earlier. How did she respond? With less resistance than I would have predicted, Thomas said, with an expression that suggested he was still processing this. He told her something. I don't know what exactly. He wouldn't tell me specifically. He said it was information he had come across through channels he couldn't detail, related to your career. He said that whatever she believed about your background and your suitability for this family, the picture she was working from was incomplete in ways that were significant. I said nothing, watching his face. She asked him to be specific, Thomas continued. He said he couldn't be specific, only that he believed, based on what he knew and based on 2 years of watching you in this family, that she was making a serious error in judgment. He paused. She didn't apologize. I want to be honest with you about that. Vivian Hargrove is not a woman who apologizes easily or quickly, but she went quiet in a way I've very rarely seen from her. The particular quiet of someone who has received information they're working to absorb. I nodded slowly. Can you tell me anything? Thomas asked. About what my father might know. I'm not asking for classified details. I'm asking in the general terms of someone who loves you and who has just spent 2 hours watching his family be turned upside down by something he doesn't fully understand. I looked at him, this man I was going to marry, this man who had trusted me for 2 years with the parts of my life that couldn't be shared and had never once made me feel diminished by the limitation. I can tell you, I said carefully, that there are aspects of my career that the people in a position to properly evaluate them, people with the context and the clearance to understand what those aspects actually represent, would not find consistent with your mother's assessment of me. That's as specific as I'm able to be, but they're significant. Yes, I said. They're significant. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. Then he said, I knew, from the beginning, that there was more to you than what you could show me. I think that's part of why I fell in love with you, actually. The sense that I was only seeing a portion of what was there, and that the portion I could see was already extraordinary. Something tightened in my chest in a way I had not expected, the particular vulnerability of being genuinely, accurately seen by someone who loves you. The parts you can't see, I said, are also part of the deal. They'll always be. I'll always be carrying things I can't fully bring home. I know, he said. I've known that since the beginning. It's part of who you are, and I love who you are. We sat together in the library while the fire burned down, not saying much, the comfortable silence of two people who have passed through something difficult together and have come out the other side still standing. Vivian Hargrove came to find me the next morning. Christmas Eve. The house had the particular smell of morning in winter, coffee and cold air and wood smoke. The smell that certain houses have when they've been lived in with care across generations. I was in the kitchen, having woken early in the way I always woke early, the habit of 11 years that had never fully released its hold on my body's internal clock. Vivian came in and poured herself a cup of coffee with the economy of movement of someone who has performed this action thousands of times in this kitchen and does not need to think about it. She stood at the counter for a moment before turning to face me. Gerald spoke to me last night, she said. I know, I said. He wouldn't tell me the specifics of what he knows, she said. He said he couldn't, which I understand from my years of being married to someone with a military background, to mean it rather than to mean he was being evasive. I waited. I want to apologize for what I said at dinner, she said. It came out with a certain difficulty, not awkwardly. Vivian was not an awkward woman, but with the particular effort of someone performing a sincerely meant act that does not come easily to them. I made an assessment of you based on limited information, and I communicated that assessment in a way that was unkind and public, and that I should not have allowed myself to reach. I am sorry. Thank you, I said. I am not, she continued, The kind of woman who reverses herself entirely because of a single evening. I want to be honest with you about that because I think you respect honesty more than comfortable fictions. I still have questions, and I will still have questions for some time about who you are and whether you and Thomas will be good for each other across a lifetime. That is not something I can resolve overnight. I wouldn't expect you to, I said. But I made a specific error yesterday, she said. I made an assumption about your worth based on markers that I've spent my life treating as reliable, and it appears those markers have missed something significant in your particular case. Gerald's certainty on this point is not something I have encountered from him often. He is not a man who makes certain statements lightly, and his certainty about you is evident. She looked at me with a particular directness that was, I had come to understand, the most genuine version of Vivian Hargrove, the version that appeared when she had decided, at least temporarily, to set aside the social performance that governed most of her interactions and simply speak as she actually thought. Tell me one thing, she said. Not classified details. Not specifics. Just one thing you're willing to tell me that helps me understand what Gerald believes he knows. I thought about this carefully. I made a decision once, I said, under conditions that most people would not have been able to think clearly in, that preserved 11 lives. The decision required everything I had spent 11 years building, every skill, every piece of judgment, every capacity I had developed across a career that wasn't visible or discussable at dinner tables. The decision worked. The 11 people lived. And I returned from that experience and went on with my life without being able to tell almost anyone what had actually happened. Vivian was very still. That's all I'm able to tell you, I said. But it's the truth, and it's enough to understand that the picture you've been working from has been, as Gerald told you, significantly incomplete. She looked at me for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes, the particular recalibration of a precise, intelligent woman encountering information that does not fit her established framework and deciding, with some visible effort, to let the framework expand rather than reject the information. All right, she said quietly. She refilled her coffee. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, in a voice considerably lower than her usual register, "The ring looks well on you, I think. I should have said so earlier." It was, I recognized immediately, the most she was going to offer in that moment. Not a full retraction. Not a complete reversal. Not the dramatic collapse of 3 years of accumulated condescension. Just that. A small, genuine concession, delivered at 6 in the morning in a kitchen that smelled of coffee and would smoke, by a woman who had decided, apparently, that she was willing to revise at least one of her conclusions. I received it for what it was. "Thank you, Vivian," I said. Thomas and I were married the following June, in a ceremony at a small church in Connecticut that was, by most external measures, a quiet and uncomplicated occasion. The family was present. Vivian Hargrove wore a dress that suited the occasion and stood in the front row and watched her son marry me with an expression that was not, I should be honest, the uncomplicated maternal joy of a woman who had always wanted exactly this for her child. But it was present, and it was genuine, and it was, I had come to understand across the months since Christmas Eve, the most honest version of her approval that her particular character was capable of offering, at least at this stage of a relationship that would, like all relationships between families, continue to develop and complicate and reveal new layers across the years that followed. Gerald Hargrove toasted us at the reception with warmth and brevity, the particular combination of a man who chooses his words with genuine care. He said nothing specific about what he knew or how he knew it. He simply said that he was proud to welcome into his family a woman whose character he had come to understand, across 2 years of careful attention, was exactly what it appeared to be: substantial, steady, and real. I accepted this toast with the composed gratitude of someone who has spent 11 years understanding the particular value of being recognized for what you actually are, not the visible version, not the edited version that can be safely presented at family dinners, but the full, complicated, mostly invisible version that exists underneath everything else, and that makes all of it possible. I want to say one final thing before I close the story, about the particular experience of carrying a life that cannot be fully shown. There's a cost to it that I have not always named honestly, even to myself. The cost of being evaluated repeatedly by people who matter to your daily life, based on a picture that is fundamentally incomplete. The cost of absorbing assessments that are wrong, not in the sense of being malicious exactly, though sometimes they are that too, but wrong in the deeper and more ordinary sense of being built from insufficient information by people who have not thought to ask better questions. Vivian Hargrove's assessment of me had been wrong in exactly this way. Not cruel in its original motivation, but built from the particular limited visibility that comes from measuring a person's worth through markers that are easy to see and discuss: family background, visible career credentials, the social register someone was born into, rather than the actual substance of what they have built, especially when that substance exists by necessity in forms that cannot be easily shown. I had absorbed her assessment for nearly 3 years without correcting it, partly because correction would have required sharing things I could not share, and partly because I had come to understand, through experience, that fighting for the recognition of people who have decided what category you belong in is one of the most exhausting projects a person can undertake, and that the alternative, simply continuing to be who you actually are and allowing the truth to surface on its own timeline, was usually the more effective approach. Gerald Hargrove's particular combination of background and observation had accelerated that timeline considerably. But I want to be honest, I do not know what would have happened without him. Whether Vivian would have eventually revised her assessment on her own, through the accumulation of years of simply watching me exist in her family. Whether Thomas and I would have navigated the distance between his mother's disapproval and our own commitment to each other without the particular catalyst of that Christmas Eve conversation. Whether the ring would still be on my finger today in the absence of Gerald's quiet, precise intervention. I do not know, and I cannot know, and I have made my peace with not knowing, because those questions belong to a version of events that did not actually happen, and I have spent too much of my career living in the real shape of actual events to spend significant time in counterfactuals. What I know is what actually happened. A man paid careful attention over 2 years to the quality of how someone moved through the world. He brought to that attention a background that gave him the capacity to recognize something others had missed. And at the right moment, he said the right thing, quietly, without drama, in a library firelit on Christmas Eve. The rest followed from that. If you have ever been told to return something that belongs to you by someone who did not understand its value, I hope you hear this clearly. The value does not depend on their understanding it. And the people who actually know what it is worth will always eventually find their way into the room. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. If something in this story reached you, I would love to hear where you are watching from and what part of it stayed with you. Stay with us. There are more stories to tell. I want to go back and tell you more about the years before Thomas, because I think the full context of what Vivian Hargrove was assessing and why her assessment was so precisely wrong requires understanding not just the professional side of my history, but the personal costs of carrying that history across years of ordinary life. I had been in 2 serious relationships before Thomas. Both had ended in the end for the same underlying reason, which was the particular difficulty, for both me and the men I had been with, of building genuine intimacy across the specific gap that my work created. The gap was not a gap of affection or commitment. It was a gap of visibility. The central, most significant portions of what I did every day, the work that shaped who I was and that I cared most deeply about, were the portions I was least able to share. The first man I had been serious about in my early 20s had not understood this at first and had come to understand it gradually, across 2 years of a relationship that was warm and genuine and that eventually foundered on his growing sense that there was a version of me he would never be permitted to know.
He was not wrong about this.
There was a version of me he would never know. But I had found in the months after that relationship ended that I was not able to feel the kind of regret about its ending that I might have expected, because what I had offered him, everything I had been able to offer within the constraints of what I could share, had been genuinely given, and the portion he felt he was missing was not something I had withheld from him, it was simply the nature of the work. The second man had been more comfortable with the gap, initially, and had communicated this comfort with the particular ease of someone who believed that a person's work was less important than their character, and that he had access to enough of my character to make the work's opacity irrelevant. He had held this position for approximately 18 months before discovering, in some moment I never fully understood, that the theory and the practice of accepting a significant invisible portion of the person you love were not quite the same experience, and that the practice was harder than the theory in ways he had not fully anticipated. That relationship, too, had ended. I had spent the 2 years between that ending and meeting Thomas living, quite contentedly, alone. I had work that mattered. I had colleagues who understood, within the limits of what could be discussed, the particular texture of what we did and what it cost. I had friendships, the kind that formed between people who had shared genuinely demanding experiences and who communicated through the shorthand of shared reference rather than extended explanation. I had a life that was, by any honest accounting, full and real and satisfying, and I had reached a particular equanimity about the question of whether it would also include, permanently, a person who could tolerate the limitations of loving someone who carried the things I carried. Thomas had been different from the beginning, not in theory but in practice, not in what he said about accepting limitations, but in how he actually behaved across the years of our relationship when those limitations were genuinely present. He had asked, in the early months, careful and considerate questions about my work. When I explained what I could and could not share, he had received this not as rejection but as information, as one of the true facts of the life he was choosing to enter into, and he had incorporated it into his understanding of us with a naturalness that I had not, by that point, encountered from anyone I had been close to. I think this was, in part, simply who Thomas was, a man with an unusual capacity for sitting comfortably with things he could not fully see or control. But I also think it was partly the result of something that does not get enough credit in how people talk about love, which is that genuine love requires a kind of epistemological humility, the willingness to accept that you do not and cannot know everything about the person you love, and that this incompleteness is not a problem to be solved but a permanent feature of what it means to love an actual person rather than a version of them assembled from everything they can show you. Thomas had that humility. He had had it from the beginning, and he had maintained it across 2 years of dating and 4 months of engagement without it appearing to cost him anything, without it looking like acceptance or resignation rather than genuine, uncomplicated comfort with the shape of the relationship as it actually was. His mother had no such humility. This was the core of Vivian Hargrove's error. Not that she was a bad person or even a particularly unkind one by her own lights, but that she had spent 63 years operating with the absolute certainty that her judgments were accurate and that the markers she used to make those judgments were reliable. The possibility that those markers could miss something significant, that the visible evidence available to her in family gatherings over 2 years could represent only a fragment of what was actually there, was simply not a framework she had been required to use before. Gerald had forced that framework on her, briefly, on Christmas Eve. And in the months that followed, I watched it become, if not natural to her, at least less actively resisted. About 4 months after the wedding, Thomas and I were visiting his parents for a weekend, the kind of ordinary visit that had become, since the Christmas Eve conversation and everything that followed it, more comfortable than it had previously been. Not entirely easy. Vivian Hargrove was not a woman who became entirely easy quickly, but genuinely warmer than the previous 2 years had produced. I was in the garden with Gerald on a Saturday afternoon, sitting on the stone bench near the rose garden that had apparently been his favorite spot in the house's grounds since his children were young, when he said something I had been half expecting for months. "I want to ask you something directly," he said. "You don't have to answer if it crosses a line." "Go ahead," I said. "The call sign," he said. I came across it several years ago through a conversation with someone I had served with who had maintained certain connections that I had let lapse. He mentioned it in a context that suggested it belonged to someone still active. Someone operating at a level I wouldn't have expected to encounter in ordinary civilian life. He paused. "When Thomas brought you home the first time, there was something about you that reminded me of certain people I had known, briefly, in my service years, people who moved through the world in a particular way that I haven't encountered often since. I held that impression for almost a year before I went back to my old contact and described you in general terms and asked if the name meant anything. I was very still. I did not confirm. I did not deny. I simply listened." "He said it did," Gerald said. "He couldn't say more than that. But he said it did." I looked out at the rose garden, the late summer roses just beginning to pass their peak. Why are you telling me this now? I said, months after the fact. Because I think you deserve to know, Gerald said, that my certainty on Christmas Eve wasn't simply based on 2 years of watching you across family dinners. I want to be honest with you about that, because I believe you value honesty considerably more than comfortable fictions. I looked at him. That's the second time I've heard someone in this family use that phrase about me. It's accurate, he said. I thought about this for a moment, the particular texture of the information he had just shared, the fact of his having pursued it, the deliberateness of his decision to go back to an old contact and ask a careful question rather than simply holding his impression and letting it sit. Thank you for telling me, I said. He nodded. There's one more thing. I waited. My contact told me one additional thing, Gerald said. He told me that the people who knew what Iron Veil meant, in the circles where it meant something, spoke about it with a particular kind of respect. Not the kind that comes from rank or seniority. The kind that comes from knowing what was done in conditions where almost anyone else would have failed. The late summer air was warm and still. The roses moved slightly in a breeze that barely registered as wind. That's all he said, Gerald continued. That's all I know, even now. But it was enough to understand that my son had found someone extraordinary and that my wife was making a very serious mistake in asking you to return that ring. I was quiet for a long time, looking at the garden, feeling the particular weight of having been seen, precisely and accurately, by someone who had paid careful enough attention to actually look. Your son, I said finally, is the best decision I've ever made. For exactly the reasons you've described. He has the same quality you do, the capacity to pay attention to what's actually there rather than only to what's easy to display. Gerald smiled, the particular smile of a man hearing something that confirms a belief he has held for years. He got it honestly, he said. We sat for a while longer in the rose garden, two people who had come to understand each other through the specific kind of attention that most people are too distracted to bring to most relationships, and the afternoon moved around us in its slow way, and the roses did what late summer roses do, and neither of us needed to say anything more. I think about Vivian Hargrove sometimes, in the years since that Christmas Eve, and I have come to understand something about her that I did not fully understand in the immediate aftermath of what she said. Her error was real, and its consequences were real, and the hurt it produced in me was real, and none of that diminishes. But underneath the error was something I recognize now more clearly than I did at the time, which was fear. Fear that her son was making a mistake she could not prevent. Fear that the family she had spent 30 years building and maintaining was going to be altered in ways she could not control. Fear that the woman he was bringing into that family carried something she could not see and could not evaluate and could not therefore manage. Vivian Hargrove was, fundamentally, a woman who managed things. She had built her life around the capacity to assess situations accurately and act on those assessments effectively, and the things she could not assess were the things that frightened her most. My career, the invisible portions of it, represented exactly that kind of uncertainty, and her response to that uncertainty had been the particular response of someone whose fear produces control rather than curiosity. Gerald had offered her the alternative to control, the possibility that some things could not be fully seen and did not need to be fully seen to be trusted. She had taken, slowly and imperfectly, the path he offered. I had come, across the year since Christmas Eve, to respect that choice and the difficulty it represented for a woman whose entire character was organized around certainty. She had never become easy, but she had become real, and real was considerably more valuable than easy, which I had learned, across 11 years of doing work that required everything I had, was almost always the case. Thank you for staying with me through this story. And to anyone who has ever been asked to return something by someone who did not understand its value, or who felt, across years of ordinary life, that the most significant parts of who they were had no language available to them in the rooms where they lived their daily life, I hope this story gave you something to carry forward. The invisible years still count. They have always counted. Stay with us. There are more stories to tell.